All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for clicking on this video again. This is another Alzheimer's disease related video. We're going to be talking about the eye this week, more specifically Alzheimer's in the eye. Imagine Alz- imagine Alzheimer's could be tested, but through the eye, via the eye. Like researchers have got to the point where they can basically use certain mechanisms to scan the eye for certain defects, certain proteins that they may be sensitive, the machines may be sensitive to, and can be located within the eye, and they can locate the biomarkers that may lead to Alzheimer's disease. So it's a new pioneer, it's a pioneering study right now. So this is just a little visual that might be explaining that a little bit more. So they scan the eye and they can tell what's going on in the brain by looking at the eye. So one thing that is not well known but is common within the scientific community is that the eye is known to be the central nervous system extension of the brain. So basically, like the eye is basically has nerve tissue that extends from the brain. The optic nerve is, it's one of the major nerves that are in the brain. So it's basically like an easiest way that you can look at the brain without having to look at bone. So current studies that exist, current ways of analyzing biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease within the brain are expensive and um, very invasive. So finding a cheap way and a non-invasive way is kind of like paramount, and it can also be good to find it as soon as possible. So that leads me to what this week's study is going to be about. This study is titled "The Eye is a Diagnostic Tool for Alzheimer's Disease." This was published in 2023, and it is in the journal Life. The authors are displayed as below, and you can go ahead and pause the video here if you want to take a mental picture and read the study later on. So basically, when you think about it, Alzheimer's is throwing a party in your brain years before memory crashes. So current tests are expensive and invasive, like I said earlier. So it's important that we find a way to analyze and understand what's going on. So here's another visual. Okay, moving on.
Welcome to Brain.
So these machines that these researchers were talking about is called a ocular coherence tomography, and then another one is also called an ocular coherence tomography angiography. So the first one, ocular coherence tomography, basically analyzes the thickness of the retina, the specific regions, specific layers within the retina that are affected by Alzheimer's disease. This has been researched mainly in the paper you can find out. And in those regions, when they look at the retinals of the people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease, they see that two specific regions tend to be affected by these, and it's basically it's basically a thinning of those layers that happens. But so the OCT basically just looks at those layers. The OCT, sorry, is ocular coherence tomography. That's just a short form. The OCT or ocular coherence tomography angiography looks at the blood vessels that are related in those areas, and it's the same kind of picture as well. Thinning, reduction of the blood vessels. I will explain further how this could happen. It's usually related to amyloid beta and neurofibrillary tangles coming within the brain, and how these proteins can still be found in these regions. But so far, the science is that if you use these machines, these ocular coherent tomographies, it's a non-invasive, cheap way to kind of assess somebody who might have Alzheimer's disease. So keep in mind that Alzheimer's disease, the pathogenesis begins 20 years before the clinical manifestations happen. So usually when the clinical manifestations have happened, you have a lot of behavioral problems, and it's harder to test the patient in that way. So, people, when it comes to Alzheimer's or dementia, there's a lot of impatience and agitation that comes with it, and studying them at that stage is can be difficult in a certain in asserting exactly what's going on with them. So it's important that this is done early, and maybe even if it's done early enough, the memory problems can be resolved way earlier before it happens. So this is a region that was seen within the within the OCT, and what you see, it's basically called a fovea avascular zone, whereby the vascular zones within within the fovea, which is the area that is uh, inundated by light. So fovea is the central portion of the retina where the blind spot exists. There's no photoreceptor cells there. But anyway, so they found that in this region it's affected by Alzheimer's by the manifestation of a less amount of vascular or capillaries. This is just a further illustration of that. So you have the photoreceptor cells up here. This is the fovea, and then these are all the other layers that are in the retina. I'm not going to really go too much in depth about them. This is for another illustration of that foveal avascular zone, where it gets bigger and bigger as the disease progresses. So in the beginning it's small, then it just progresses. So how did scientists come to think that they could even find these peculiarities in this area of the body? So tears have receipts. Basically, proteins, a lot of proteins exist within the tears and within various regions of the brain, including amyloid. So usually they found that people who have or who have Alzheimer's disease, when they analyze their tears, there is amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tangles that are found inside those tears. Same comes with the pupillary constriction. So the constriction of your pupils is basically conducted by the cholinergic system. So the cholinergic system is a system that is usually affected by Alzheimer's disease, usually the first system that's affected. And even when you look at the treatments, some of the drugs they tend to focus on increasing the release of this neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine. So this cholinergic system is usually it's usually associated with the constriction and the dilation of the pupillary muscles. So they found that people who have Alzheimer's disease, whenever they are doing um, complex tasks, so usually when you're doing complex tasks in normal everyday situations and you don't have Alzheimer's disease, your pupils will basically dilate whenever the task gets more and more complex. So they found that the people who had the least amount, or the people who had the most amount of amyloid plaques or Alzheimer's disease pathology or Alzheimer's disease behavior, their pupils would dilate whenever they were doing tasks that were kind of simple. So that just basically showed that, they could see a pupil, if somebody's pupils are kind of dilated. I don't want to make that big generalization, but it's just something that they found, that essentially pupils would dilate whenever they were doing tasks that were not so complex. I think what the biggest giveaway was the fact that they found out that the cornea has nerves. It has a lot of nerve innervation, and people who have Alzheimer's disease, their corneas, nerves, their density, their branching, and their length starts to decrease dramatically. So when they compared it, and this was probably the only thing out of the entire study that was consistent amongst multiple other studies that would come after to try to replicate what the previous study did. So they found that in each time that they tested people who had Alzheimer's disease, and they looked at their corneas, the corneal nerve fiber length, density, and branching, they always found that it was lesser for those who had Alzheimer's disease as those who didn't. So this is probably one of the best and all the best that I can take out, the best takeaway from this study. Another thing was that the vitreous and the aqueous humors, although they're mostly water, they also have a certain degree of proteins within them, and in some cases, they can find amyloid beta within them. But The only problem with this is that the only way they can find them is by essentially extracting or going under the knife and surgical intervention, and that can be costly, and also it can cause other problems that can be avoided by not going that route. Another thing is they also found that people who have cataracts, so cataracts basically formed by the fact that the crystalline lens that's in front of your eye, it also has proteins on them, and as we progress, as we get older, there is a buildup of certain proteins that can lead up to even amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. AB40 and AB42, I believe, were found in lenses of people who have cataracts. So that was another way that they could have identified it, but it wasn't really as strong. Um, wasn't a strong finding. In some cases, it didn't always lead to that. Yeah, so it's hard to kind of do these studies without like also talking about the comorbidities like glaucoma and diabetes. Usually, when you have those aberrant vasculatures that we were talking about earlier, you can also have them when the person also has diabetes and glaucoma. So it's important that when these tests are done, that the comorbidities are done, and the researchers made sure of that. So that's just something that I wanted to add as well. And also to touch on another thing about the amyloid plaques is, as I stated, how the retina is kind of part of the central nervous system. Sometimes the amyloid plaques can build up to such a degree that they cause the vasculature to be very aberrant, and this causes the retina to reduce vascular endothelial growth factor, and this is supposed to help it grow more vessels around the area. But because of the increase of the amyloid plaques within that region, sometimes the release of this VEGF, the vascular endothelial growth factor, can be lost within the clumps of amyloid plaques and never reach where it's supposed to reach, causing further reduction in the vasculature and um, you know and reducing sight, as well as messing all the other things up within the head and the brain. So it's just a matter of discovering whether it's this thing that can help us find out. It's not an end all be all, it's not going to tell us that, you have Alzheimer's disease, but is it going to at least help us find out, sooner rather than later? But as it goes, based on the study, routine eye imaging, you look at the patterns in the retina, cognitive and medical assessment, then you go into the other CSF, PET biomarkers. Those are more sensitive and will always give you more. So if you find this out earlier, you can at least be sure that you can, start the procedures to kind of lessen the impact that this disease might have. Because as it's gone, the study was claiming that this disease is basically on route to costing more than $1 trillion in the United States. So it's something that has to be taken seriously. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm going to be doing more. If you get a chance to just kind of look at it and let me know if there's anything I can do to, improve these videos and make them more interactive, more interesting. But thanks again, and hope you have a great day. All right, bye.